I've spent the last year training like a hybrid athlete for the first time in my life, and with the whole 12 months of consistently running and lifting behind me, I've made some pretty decent progress. So in this video, I'm going to break down that progress into 3 distinct categories: fitness, strength, and body composition, to show what's possible for an average person in only a single year of hybrid training. I'll walk you through exactly how I trained, and because unlike some other YouTubers, I'm certainly not anywhere near a full-time athlete, how I also balance this around all the other demands that life throws at you. And by the end, I might even answer the question of whether or not hybrid training lives up to the hype. So before I get into how much I've improved my bench press or my 5k PB or even my physique, it's important to understand where I started from before I even knew what a hybrid athlete was. I'd injured my left shoulder playing rugby at med school and then spent the last few years of university powerlifting whilst also rejecting all opportunities to do any cardio. But after putting it off for a while, I had shoulder surgery at the end of 2019, which sort of robbed me of all my strength and muscle. And my recovery was then hampered by all the gyms closing in the subsequent COVID pandemic. So when I graduated med school and started full-time work as a doctor in that pandemic, my training inevitably took a back seat. So up until last year, I've been heading to the gym a couple of times a week, just going through the motions with little direction or motivation to train. Which brings us back to 2023, when I moved to New Zealand with my wife for 6 months, which I thought was a perfect opportunity to try something new. I wasn't calling it hybrid training at the time, I was just mixing in the occasional 5k with some more consistent weightlifting in the gym. Sports and exercise had used to be a big part of my life, but since starting full-time work, like a lot of people, I'd neglected my fitness. So I hoped my new training would reignite my love for working out, and in the process, transform my cardiovascular endurance and dwindling strength. So did that happen? Well, to answer that, let's move on to my first benchmark of progress, which is strength. Building strength is hard work, and from my peak in 2019, I'd fallen a long way. But almost a year ago today, I published one of my first videos on YouTube. And whilst we're talking about hard work, I'd challenge you to watch the full-length video. It's pretty bleak. But what this video lacked in charisma or production quality, it makes up for in objective measures of strength. I opened the video by flaunting my mediocre credentials as a strength athlete, and 1 rep max in my squat, bench and deadlift. And I'll show you how that went. So nothing crazy and far from my heaviest lifts of all time, but I think these are still respectable numbers and satisfying in the sense that I'm benching 2 plates, squatting 3 plates and pulling 4 plates. As I said, what little training I had been doing coming to the start of last year was weightlifting, albeit very inconsistently. And my strength training in this last year since that day has been pretty modest, but certainly more consistent. I've continued lifting weights 2 to 3 times most weeks, spending around an hour in the gym at a time. I pretty much exclusively focus on these 8 movements and do upper and lower body compound lifts every time I'm in the gym. Here's what an average week looks like for me at the moment, for instance. And I rarely do any accessory or isolation lifts. I train a range of different rep schemes month to month and follow my own type of linear progression, which is very similar to how I used to train when I was competing as a powerlifter, but just at much lower volumes and frequencies, and lower weights too. So about a month ago I thought it was time to test my strength and see where I was at. So I headed to see an old friend of mine, Chris, who lives in London. He's also big into powerlifting and an excellent hype man. Not much of a runner, mind, but each their own. And he took me to his local gym to test my 1 rep maxes, and this is how it went. So yeah, fairly small improvements, but I was happy with my progress, especially considering I hadn't peaked for these attempts, but still managed to put on 50 kilos to last year's total. I'm still far off where I used to be when I was competing in powerlifting, but my training back then was way more intense and I was a much heavier body weight, which I'll come back to later. The 2 to 3 hours I'm now spending in the gym on a weekly basis is far more sustainable. And I've proven that despite this huge drop in training volume and the competing stimulus of regular running, I can still make steady progress with my strength. So my cardiovascular conditioning comes in the form of running, and in 2023, I was a rank amateur in the sport. I'd done the odd bit of track during sports days at school and had always had a decent level of fitness, playing team sports as a kid, but since retiring from rugby after the shoulder problems in 2018, cardio was not a big part of my life. So fed up being unfit, in spring last year I started jogging and threw in the odd park run here and there. And if you look back to my park run results from May 2023, after my first few months of inconsistent running, I was clocking in pretty average times for a male in his late 20s. As I said, I wasn't in awful shape, but nothing to start a whole YouTube channel about. Anyway, around this time I started a whole YouTube channel, and this was really when running became a more regular habit for me. It had taken me a few months to adjust to the new stimulus, because after years of being relatively sedentary, even doing a couple 5Ks a week resulted in a string of minor injuries. But by May last year, my body had developed some tolerance to the repetitive strain that is running, and I'd learned that trying to PB every single run wasn't a sustainable way of training. So in these first few months I experienced pretty exceptional improvements in pace and fitness. I ran my first sub 20 minute 5K by the middle of June after 6 weeks or so of consistently running 15 to 20k each week, plus a few months before that of easing myself into the sport. I was basically benefiting from newbie gains because this was the first time I'd applied myself methodically to running, and I was able to keep making progress by staying healthy, keeping the vast majority of my runs at lower intensities or conversational pace and being cautious with increasing my mileage. My training since then has mainly been focused around building the aerobic base I've been neglecting for years, so lots and lots of zone 2 running, and my attempts at PBing those middle distances have been exceedingly rare. I quickly discovered what I enjoyed most was getting onto the trails rather than the high intensity track or road workouts. So I ended up doing a few different fell running events last winter and then diving into the deep end and booking some ultramarathons for this summer. This required me to vastly increase my cardiovascular endurance, so these last few months I've been regularly hitting around 60 or 70 kilometers of running each week, working almost exclusively in zone 2 or 3. But I did build up to these training volumes really slowly over the last 12 months. But back to my progress, and I ran my first ever marathon in April, which I completed in 3 hours and 27 minutes. I followed that up with a 50k ultra last month with a lot of elevation, which took me more like 6 hours. And that was just a warm up for the 100k I'm running, which I've been building up to this whole year. In fact, by the time this video goes live on a Sunday, I will have hopefully ran that 100k ultra the day before, so fingers crossed I finished it, and drop me a follow on Strava to see how I got on. But 50Ks and 100Ks, they're probably not the best ways to measure progress, because it's hard to think about what an objectively good time is in these events, because for most people finishing them is the challenge, and that's certainly the case for me too. I did do a 10k a few weeks back without any preparation other than my standard zone 2 training and managed to go sub 40, but I don't really have a previous 10k effort to compare this to and see how I've progressed over the last 12 months. And with all my long distance running, I haven't tried another 5k PB since last year, but I suppose a sub 40 10k requires a high level of fitness than a sub 25k, because you're doing 2 of them back to back. But anyway, my newfound ability to tolerate large running volumes represents a huge increase in my aerobic fitness, regardless of what my top level speed is over the more easily comparable middle distance 5 and 10ks. And that is the culmination of a long year of consistent training. I'd be interested to hear what you guys think is the equivalent of a 1 rep max squat, bench press and deadlift when it comes to running. What are the objective measures of fitness runners use to test their own progress or as a baseline versus others? So comment down below if you've got any ideas. Changing my body composition or building an aesthetic physique has not been an aim of mine, which is probably quite obvious. I do not look like a bodybuilder. But when I started running and lifting, I cared far more about improving my health and fitness, staying injury free, and then finally trying to increase my performance, so my strength and endurance. That being said, I have shifted my body composition in a slightly more favourable direction this last year, simply as a consequence of my training style. I lift weights regularly, I eat a balanced diet, and I do loads of zone 2 or fat burning cardio. So compared with last year, that means I have some more muscle mass and a relatively low body fat, which is all you really need to start looking athletic. If I show you some photos of when I used to powerlift, I was holding on to much more muscle then at a body weight between 88 and 93 kilograms. But because of my high body fat percentage, mainly through lack of cardio and a more calorie dense diet, I look less trained, at least without a shirt on. Of course I like to look and feel good, who doesn't? But I feel like I found a happy medium with my current physique. I eat foods that I like and I can still indulge occasionally. I'm training the way I enjoy without having to throw in loads of accessory or isolation movements in the gym. And I'm sitting at a body weight which is comfortable to run at. If I was lighter I might be a bit faster, and if I was heavier I might be a bit more jacked. But compromise is fundamental to hybrid training. Unfortunately not everyone can be Nick Bare, who looks like a professional bodybuilder but runs like a Kenyan Olympian. But looking back a couple of years after my shoulder surgery and during my period of general apathy towards working out, I was in okay shape. I estimate I was probably between 15 to 20% body fat, so compared to now that's not been a dramatic change. Currently I'd say I'm leaner, probably more like 10 to 15% body fat, and I'm a few kilos heavier. So yeah, that represents more lean muscle and less fat, but again, from a very reasonable starting point. So not exactly a super scientific breakdown, nor a particularly impressive transformation, but I think it's a realistic one after a year of hard work and taking into account where I was starting from. So finally, how much have I actually been training this last year? Well, at my absolute peak of ultramarathon training, I've been doing around 7 hours of running and 3 hours on top of that in the gym, plus probably an hour or so extra of stretching and prehab work. So 11 hours in total each week. And to be honest, I know a lot of people who train for ultramarathons do far more distance in training than I was doing, so this is actually on the low side. But I'm not going to pretend that that was easy. This felt like quite a lot of work and will be tricky to sustain going forwards, especially balancing with my job, running a YouTube channel, spending time with my wife and everything else I do in life. This last year I generally trained 6 days a week, with one of those days being a double training day where I'd both run and lift weights, and there being one rest day too. But on a more typical week, it was probably more like 3 hours in the gym, 4 hours of running, and then the added hour of mobility, which felt much more manageable. My shift pattern as a doctor working in the emergency department means I do a lot of evening and night shifts, so I'm generally free in the mornings or days to work out. And then I also do a couple of days a week from home working on this channel, so I can be flexible with my time and again train when I want. So I appreciate that this isn't a super relatable routine to most people who might do a 9 to 5. But to stay consistent, it's just about making training a habit in your life and fitting it where you can. There's no magic solution to how you fit several hours of training around a busy schedule. It will take some sacrifice. But thinking about my fitness as a non-negotiable part of my routine, rather than an optional extra that gets dropped first when I'm busy, was a good way to start. So how you want to run a hybrid training split is totally up to you. Although I'd recommend to anyone to run an ultramarathon at some point in their life for how rewarding and fun the whole process is, that is by no means the minimum barrier to entry, and it does require a lot of your free time. So after this 100k, I'll for sure be running less miles each week, and with this event it will feel like the end of a chapter and time to reassess my training splits and goals looking ahead to the next 12 months. And that's the beauty of hybrid training, it's whatever you want it to be. I had just as much fun doing a couple 5Ks a week around my lifting to begin with as I am now running silly distances alongside my gym work. And I hope I stand as proof that you can make progress with two apparently opposite disciplines at the same time. And finally, would I recommend hybrid training? Well yeah, obviously I run a whole YouTube channel on the topic. It's been transformative for my own enjoyment of training, but also my health and fitness. As humans, I actually think it's the best way to train, because we evolved to run and chase our prey, but also to pick that shit up and carry it back to camp. So really we've been hybrid training for millennia. And if you enjoyed this video, please drop it a like, because it really helps the channel, and for more running, lifting and general fitness content, I'll see you again next time.